Well, welcome to this Google Tech Talk. My name is Dan Riker. I'm Director of Climate Change and Energy Initiatives for Google.org. Very pleased to have David Victor here today to talk about renewable electricity cheaper than coal, particularly the coal side of that equation. And I'll get to David's background in a second, but just for a brief background, RE less than C, renewable electricity cheaper than coal, is a Google initiative that we launched in January, focused on, as the formula indicates, lowering the cost of renewable electricity to make it cheaper than coal, which in our view is what it's going to take if renewable electricity is really going to take its appropriate role in our mix in the U.S. and worldwide. And the initiative has several elements to it: an R&D piece. We've got a group of engineers at Google now working on some of these challenges, and some of them are here today. An investment component. We've made several investments in renewable energy-related companies, particularly those with very promising technologies that can take us down the renewable electricity cost curve. The third is the area of policy. We're working on, in particular, on policy opportunities in Washington, and we'll be making some announcements about those in the next couple of months. And the fourth is information tools, what we can do with our own Google tools to really put a spotlight on renewable electricity, to get to consumers, to get to investors, to get to policymakers, and influence the sort of changes we need to see to really realize the benefits of renewable electricity. Most of our focus has been on the RE side of the RE less than C equation. What's exciting about today's talk by David Victor is we're going to hear about the status of coal, where we are with coal, the global supplies, where we see coal technology headed, because ultimately we can do some on the RE side, but we've obviously also got to be very focused on what's happening to the price of coal as well in this competitive landscape. David is a professor of law at Stanford Law School and also directs the program on energy and sustainable development. His current research focuses on the role of state-controlled oil companies in the oil market, on the design of effective strategies for protecting the global climate, and the emerging global market for coal. He's also an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he was senior advisor to the Council's Task Force on Climate Change and leads study groups on improving management of the nation's $50 billion strategic oil reserve and on devising foreign policy strategy for regulation of geoengineering. He's an author of many, many books, numerous articles. His PhD is from MIT in political science and international relations, and has a BA from Harvard in history and science. He also has one of the coolest pair of glasses in Silicon Valley. It is my great pleasure to introduce David Victor.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Dan. Thanks to the Google team to invite me to come and talk about heavy iron, if you like, the heavy iron in the energy system. We're doing a bunch of work at this program that I lead at Stanford, and really no single person can do justice to it. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about what we're doing generally, and then in the Q&A introduce my colleagues Varun Rai, Richard Morse, and Jeremy Carl, who are working in much greater depth on particular parts of this research and are the true experts. You're in the middle of this extraordinary initiative, RE is less than C, and we started asking some questions about what's going on with C, because there's a relationship here, and I think you're going to be surprised, in some cases shocked, with what's happening on the right-hand side of this relationship. Think of this as a dog chasing a bus, and your RE initiative is feeding the dog with some steroids to help it catch up to the bus. I want to talk about the bus, what's happening with the bus. I'm part of a research group that works on a wide range of topics that we call the political economy of energy markets. So it's about the political, legal, and institutional aspects of energy systems. Much of our work is in the emerging markets: Brazil, China, India, Mexico, and South Africa. Up on the screen here, you see the list of topics that we've been working on, ranging from electricity and natural gas markets to the role of state oil companies in the world oil market. And now our newest initiative is to get academics focusing on coal. You know, coal really matters, not only because it's it's the right-hand side of your equation, but it is in essentially all of the world's largest economies, it's the dominant part of the energy system. This country, it's 51% of all the electricity that we generate is from coal. In China and India, the fractions are even higher. So we're doing a bunch of work to model the global coal market today and in the future and try and understand where coal prices come from, what might happen to coal, what the future of coal is in a carbon-constrained world if we really get serious about cutting greenhouse gas emissions. I'm going to talk broadly about two things in this talk. The first one is what's going on with the coal markets themselves and the role of CO2 prices, so CO2, carbon dioxide, the leading human cause of climate change, and how CO2 affects the viability of coal. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about new coal technologies and about the prices and costs of those technologies. That is the ultimate target in your own RE is less than C initiative, is to make RE reliably less expensive than coal-based technologies. First, let me talk a little bit about coal price formation. Where do coal prices come from? Because as Dan mentioned in his introduction, we need to know what the price of coal is going to be if we're going to understand the relationship and the competitiveness of renewable energy. Where do coal prices come from, and what are the patterns in coal prices? This slide here shows you the price of the three major fossil fuels in the main trading markets in the world over time back to 1995. Up to the present day. The vertical axis is perhaps a little bit unfamiliar. It's dollars per million BTU. Million BTU is the main unit for heat of fuels. And so what we've done is we've taken all these different fuels and converted them into common heat units so that we can normalize for the differences in the heat content between a barrel of oil and a ton of coal and a cubic foot of natural gas. And what we see on the top is the price of oil, then the price of natural gas, and the price of various coals. There isn't yet a global market for natural gas, but one is emerging, and there is not yet a global market for coal, but there are several different coals that are traded internationally, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. As everybody knows, the price of oil has risen quite sharply in the last 5 to 6 years for a variety of reasons I'd be happy to talk about in the Q&A period. What's interesting, though, in my view, is that natural gas has followed oil to higher prices. And that's because for some applications, gas and oil compete directly with each other. And in most of the world, natural gas, bulk natural gas, is traded on contracts that are indexed to the price of oil, which means that as we develop an integrated global market for natural gas, when the price of oil rises, the price of natural gas rises. That helps explain the phenomenon we're going to be trying to understand today, which is why has the price of coal risen? And as you've seen in the last roughly year and a half, the price of coal has risen dramatically, roughly a factor of 3, depending on which market you're in. So already the dog is catching up to the bus, mainly for reasons that have nothing to do with the dog and a lot to do with the bus and the bus's competitors. In a nutshell, what's happening here is that because oil prices rise and therefore gas prices rise, not strictly in lockstep, but broadly, gas becomes less competitive with coal, and that raises the demand for coal, and therefore coal is becoming more expensive. Now let's talk a little more detail about the potential demand for coal looking out into the future, because that'll give us a sense of what coal prices might be like in the future, and that's ultimately one of the things we really care a lot about when we talk about RE is less than C. So let me talk about coal demand. The first thing that is extraordinary, and I apologize on behalf of the energy modeling community that this is news, but it is always news, and you will read about it periodically in the newspaper, which is that the models we use for projecting total demand for fuels in the world's system are very slow to catch up to reality. And the reality over the last few years has been that oil prices and therefore gas prices have been rising. Every time the major modeling groups update their models that are used to project future consumption of the major fossil fuels and other sources of energy, every time in the last few years they've updated their models, two things have happened that are interesting. One of them is their expectations for the consumption of energy in China are even higher than they expected before. I'll talk about that in a second. And the other one is that their expectation about the role of coal in the world energy system become more and more bullish, or if you're worried about CO2, bearish, but their projection of the role of coal in the world energy system rises. And that's because natural gas prices are rising. And when you tell these models about ever higher prices of natural gas, they solve in ways that in effect put more coal in the world's energy system. That means if you're worried about CO2, which is coal is the most carbon intensive of fossil fuels, it emits the most carbon dioxide, global warming gas, per unit energy. If you're worried about CO2, ironically, the rise in oil prices has actually been bad news for the CO2 problem. It's encouraged more efficiency because when fuel is more expensive, people conserve. But the opposite has happened in the electric power sector. It has encouraged in most of the world actually a swing back in the direction of coal, making coal arguably more competitive. And this slide just underscores the problem. These are snapshots 3 times in history, the year 2004 on the left, 2006 in the middle, and 2008 on the right, showing the total projected world consumption of energy from major sources out in the year 2020. So this is, if you like, this is a way of checking to see how consistent the energy modeling community is. And what you see is back in 2004, where the models more or less didn't know about what was going on then, but knew that gas was cheap because they were using data from the late 1990s, they projected that the role of coal in the world market would be relatively smaller than what they project today. Natural gas they were very enthusiastic about. And as gas prices have risen, the role of coal, the expected role of coal, has continued to rise even higher. So in some senses, it is actually getting harder to unseat coal due to the high prices of oil and natural gas. Let's unpack this in a little more detail. One piece of conventional wisdom is that, well, maybe the prices are favoring coal, but at least in the United States, for example, you can't actually site a coal plant because if somebody tries to build a coal-fired power plant, the local neighbors are going to organize an opposition and they're going to take you to court and so on. So this is from a study just released a couple weeks ago that has been tracking every single coal plant in the country over the last roughly decade and a half. And what it shows, this slide here just shows for coal plants, what it shows are announced projects, the tallest bars, and it shows projects that are under construction in red, and then actually new built projects every year going back to the year 2000. And what's happened is that local opposition to coal plants has slowed them down, but has in fact not stopped the siting of new coal-fired power plants. And the big news you'll be reading about in the newspaper over the next year or so is that in fact we have roughly a wall of coal-fired power plants, even in this country where people are increasingly worried about carbon dioxide and other environmental problems. That wall of plants is coming online. At the end of my talk, I'll try and put this in perspective with other kinds of fuels. And this is because we read a lot about the cancellations of plants in the newspaper, but nobody ever takes the kind of big picture to understand which plants are going forward and which plants aren't going forward, and that's what this slide shows. That's the picture for the United States, and it underscores a point, which is you should not expect the demand for coal in the United States to wane anytime soon. This is a picture that underscores the scale of the challenge that you have in front of you as affects China and India. This is a slide from the International Energy Agency in Paris. Every year they put out a large study on the state of the world's energy market. And it shows for the major fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, nuclear, hydro, renewables, and the total. It shows out in the year 2030 what they project to be the shares of these different fuels and who's going to contribute to the rise of this share. What you see here is China, which is shown in red, and India, which is shown in yellow. Those two countries alone are expected to be 80% of the rise in demand for coal out to the year 2030. So I think one of the challenges when we think about RE as less than C is not only making RE less than C in this country and other leading industrialized countries, but also the emerging markets. And I think in particular we ought to have a discussion about how you make this the case in India and in China. Almost every discussion about the world's energy system at the end of the day comes back to China because that's an extraordinary economy, many people growing so rapidly, experiences that Google knows extremely well. Just another slide or two about the situation in India and China. One of the reasons they're burning coal is, not surprisingly, they have a lot of coal. This slide on the left for India and on the right for China just shows their current fossil fuel reserves according to the types of fossil fuels. Coal, which in India is 85%, in China 94% oil and natural gas. And so one of the reasons that they burn coal is, frankly, they've got an enormous amount of coal, and until recently, the coal has been proximate and relatively inexpensive to acquire. Let me just add a footnote here, which is you've been reading a lot in the newspapers about the controversies around oil reserves and natural gas reserves, and how much oil is actually out there in the world, and some companies have been cooking the books on their reserves and so on. Arguably, the data on reserves for coal are even worse than the data on reserves for oil and natural gas. So do not be surprised if in the coming years we actually learn that although the world seems to be awash in coal reserves, don't be surprised if we actually learn that there's a lot less coal out there than we originally thought. It's harder to get to, and the quality of that coal is much lower. To put this in perspective, in the last 10 days alone, the U.S. Geological Survey has revised its estimates for the giant coal field outside Gillette, Wyoming, which accounts for 2/3 roughly of total U.S. coal production. And this one reassessment reduced the estimate of the reserves there by 29%. So we're learning an enormous amount about the quality and size of coal reserves. Right now, they're pointing in the direction to most of the data having overestimated the size of coal reserves, and therefore becoming more expensive to get coal out of the ground. And when you put that together, what you have is a story about continued high demand for coal, some difficulties in supplying coal, and therefore probably high coal prices, which will have some really interesting implications for RE as less than C. If you bear with me just another 2 slides to give you a sense of what factors drive the decisions in China and India about which kinds of power plants to build. This slide here, and we're going to make copies of the slides available, so you don't need to madly type all this down, gives you a snapshot of the situation in both China and India right now. Both of them are huge coal producers. China is actually by far the largest coal producer, accounting for almost half of the total world production. But both countries, interestingly enough, right now are facing significant shortages in supply. So their domestic industries are unable to keep up with the need for coal. This is part of the reason why you'll be reading in the newspapers about a series of blackouts in China because of faltering coal supplies, and similar kinds of stories for complex reasons in India. Both countries last year were actually importers of coal. So we think of China and India as countries with enormous amounts of coal. They must be producing coal like mad. And until a year ago, that was the case for China. China was a net exporter. Last year was the first year in modern recorded history where China has actually been a net importer of coal. And we think it's likely in the future that both these countries will continue to be importers of coal. One last point about this, which is, when we think about RE as less than C, we have to pay close attention to which factors drive the decisions to build coal-fired power plants. And those factors, you can imagine some of them immediately. What is the cost of coal? What does it cost to build a coal-fired power plant? In China and India and other emerging markets, another factor turns out to be incredibly important, and that is the cost of capital, the cost of money. Because coal-fired power plants are extremely capital intensive. And most of the companies that build them are state-owned companies that have access to money, unlike private companies. Their money, their capital, is much cheaper to get to than private companies face in those same markets. And this slide just gives you a sense of this. For one province in China, the province of Guangdong, these are some modeling results that we've put together and released late last year that shows the expected demand for coal and for energy if we tell the model that all parts of the economy have the same cost of capital, which is the way most efficient economies actually operate. And this shows us the results if we tell the model that state enterprises that build coal-fired power plants have access to really cheap capital, but companies that use energy, their capital is extremely expensive. And the difference is enormous. So our models, when we tell them that the cost of capital is the same everywhere in the economy, they actually predict coal starting to exit parts of the Chinese economy already because of local air pollution concerns and so on. When we would tell them about the real cost of capital, it ironically becomes even harder to unseat coal from these economies. I want to switch gears now and talk a little bit about the international trade in coal, and then I'm going to end by talking about the cost of different coal-fired technologies. We're all used to reading about the world oil market, and now every day it seems like the news begins with whatever the price of oil is, up or down, and then they try and tack the national mood to whatever the price of oil is. Oil is a fungible commodity. Almost all oil, the vast majority of it, trades in international markets. It's very cheap, only a few dollars a barrel to move oil around, and so the price of oil almost everywhere in the world is a function of the behavior of the international marketplace. That is starting to happen for coal, but because coal is harder to move, the dynamics of the coal market are very different. This will be arguably the single most important factor in helping us understand RE is less than C, understanding the bus and how rapidly it's moving and what the cost of coal is the changing structure of this international coal market. And in a couple slides, I just want to walk through what's happening in this marketplace so that you can hopefully appreciate what is likely to be the big news in the coming few years. The first thing to underscore is that total world trade in coal has risen dramatically in the last 2 decades. If you rewind the tape of history 2 decades ago, back to the 1980s, what you saw is very small quantities of coal compared to total world demand that was traded internationally, and half or so of that coal was specialty coal used for making steel, so-called coking coal. And the reason for that is very simple. Coking coal is a whole lot more valuable than what's called steam coal, which is used in power plants for making steam and therefore electricity. So whenever a product's more valuable, you can usually justify the extra cost of putting it on a ship and transporting around. Nobody's yet, you're in an incredibly high value-added industry, and so this point may not fully sink in, because when you have a physical product that's incredibly valuable, you call up FedEx and you put it in a FedEx envelope, and the next day it's somewhere else in the country, or 2 days later it's anywhere else in the world, because the cost of transport is such a small portion of the total value of what you're moving around. Nobody is FedExing coal around yet, but maybe there'll be a change in that with innovation. The reason for this rapid rise in the international trade in coal is tied to lots of factors, the single most important of which is the dramatic decline in the cost of shipping overall over the last few decades. All of the increase in coal shown here over time, all of the increase in international trade in coal has come from steam coal. So coking coal is flat. Land-based trade in coal by trucks and rails and so on is flat. The story is the increase in steam coal for making electricity on boats now globally. This is a global marketplace. How do we think about the impact of this on prices for coal? This slide here is going to show us the price of a handful of important marker coals. So coals traded in different marketplaces and the freight rates. So here is the price of coal rising over time. The freight rate, so this is the part of the coal price that is shipping, so this is the equivalent of the FedEx bill. The freight rates have been extremely volatile, and when the price of coal goes up, freight rates usually go up a little bit. That's because people in the shipping business know when their product and the product they're moving around is extremely valuable, and they demand some of that money for themselves. But overall, the big effect has been that the price of coal has gone up, and an awful lot of that has been reflected in the ultimate final price of coal and in the value that coal producers get. This is going to have an enormous impact on coal prices, and that's what I'd like to show you in this slide here. This slide shows us the price of coal in the Atlantic Basin in Europe, which is shown in yellow, and in Appalachia, which is shown in the blue here. And what you see, although the connection between the two is not perfect, what you see is that in the eastern seaboard of the United States, the price of coal today is broadly coming out of the European market. And that's because the price of natural gas in Europe is incredibly high, and with expensive natural gas in Europe, they're actually having an incentive to burn more coal, and they're pulling that coal out of the US marketplace. If you look down here at this yellow line, it hasn't moved at all. And this yellow line is the price of coal in the western part of the United States, in the Powder River Basin, around Gillette, Wyoming, in the northeastern corner of Wyoming. And the reason that doesn't move is because the capacity to move that coal is already fully tapped out. The railroad capacity, 2/3 of the nation's coal comes from the Powder River Basin. And no matter what happens in the international market today, you don't see those coal prices changing. But over time, almost everywhere in the world that you look and see markets getting exposed to the international conditions, what you're seeing is the price of coal starting to connect to each other everywhere in the world. I want to close this discussion about coal prices with just a word or two about carbon and CO2. Because one of the reasons that you're worried about RE being less than C is you're worried, as you should be, about global warming and the consequences of global warming. And one part of a strategy to fix this is to put a price on CO2 emissions, to get the marketplace to send a signal that we should stop causing as many CO2 emissions as we are already. There are now several markets in the world that price CO2. Almost all of them work through something called a cap and trade system, like with the one we're developing here in California, where the government puts a limit on total CO2 emissions, and they give companies, or in some cases individuals, the right to trade those limits. And this is a little bit like the day traders in the late 1990s. And you can then trade these credits, and the market price for CO2 goes up and down as people's expectations about demand and supply for CO2 credits as those expectations change. And this slide shows over time for these markets back to January 2002. The experience so far has been very, very brief with carbon markets. There was an early one in Britain. There's been one running along in Australia. There's a market here in the United States, a voluntary market called the Chicago Climate Exchange. And the biggest market by far, shown here in the blue, is what's called the emission trading scheme in Europe. So this is by far the largest market and the most significant effort anywhere in the world to put a price on carbon and to encourage companies to switch away from carbon. The vertical axis shows us dollars per ton of CO2 emitted. So the European market today is trading in the neighborhood of $40 to $50 per ton of CO2. That's a significant increase in the price of CO2 and has produced incentives for companies to look for ways to generate electricity, make industrial products, heat homes and buildings that have a much lighter carbon footprint. But my question is, what impact has this had on coal? You would expect that coal would be seriously disadvantaged in this world, because coal, relative to natural gas, which is its main rival in generating electricity in most of Europe, coal emits twice as much carbon dioxide per unit electricity as natural gas. So every kilowatt hour of natural gas produced using coal, twice as much CO2 as natural gas. If you put a price on CO2, you would expect that that would result in companies not dispatching as much coal and instead buying more natural gas. What's happened in Europe is exactly the opposite. This slide shows you the same data we had before. The price of carbon, the vertical axis in this case, because we're being European, is euros per ton, over time, for the December 2009 contract to have an emission trading credit. And the price is on the order of 25 euros per ton, in the $40 to $50 $40 to $50 per ton range, the same chart that I showed earlier. This next line shows you what's called the carbon parity price. This is the price at which carbon would have to be priced in order to make gas and coal equally competitive in the European market. So not to favor gas, but just to make them competitive. And what you see is the carbon parity price is twice the level of the current carbon price in Europe. So in the world's most active system for regulating carbon dioxide, in fact, the price of carbon, for near-term investment decisions, the price of carbon is in fact nowhere near as high as it needs to be in order to change significantly behavior. The reason for that, very briefly, is that the price of oil is high, and therefore the price of gas is incredibly high, because the largest single supplier of gas in Europe is Russia, and almost all the Russian contracts going into Europe have their gas price indexed the price of oil. So even though coal has risen a fair bit in the last year and a half, all in, coal is in fact more competitive today compared with natural gas than was the case 5 years ago. I want to switch gears now and close my talk with a little bit of discussion about what you guys do best and what RE is less than C is mainly about, which is technology. And I want to talk a little bit about advanced coal technologies and how we might think about those technologies. The first slide here is designed to give you a sense of scale. There's been a lot of talk in the news about what are called carbon capture and storage power plants. In the jargon, CCS, carbon capture and storage. These are power plants where you redesign the power plant to produce a smokestack that doesn't have a low density, low pressure stream of pollution, which is what is the norm for smokestacks, but instead has a very high concentrated, high pressure stream of carbon dioxide. And you turn the smokestack upside down and you inject it underground, where the CO2 presumably stays safe from the atmosphere and therefore doesn't cause global warming. People in the heavy iron of the electric power industry, folks who are interested in nuclear and coal and advanced gas plants and so on, they're banking a lot on this technology, CCS, because they think this is going to be one of the ways to use a lot more coal and also to reduce emissions of carbon dioxide. And I want to just walk through a couple slides to give you a sense of what's going on with this technology so far. The first one is a sense of scale. This slide here shows over time, back to 1990, up to the present day, and then projections out to the future of the total emissions of carbon dioxide from all sources, all electric power sources in the United States. So this is the pulse of the electric power industry in the United States. The leading industry organization, research organization, was asked a couple years ago to take a look at what the industry could do to reduce its emissions. That industry, actually right here locally, the Electric Power Research Institute, does, I think, by far the best analytical work in this area. And this slide summarizes the results of their research. What they show is that if you wanted to take the emissions of CO2 from the electric power sector, and instead of having them grow up continuously as they are currently slated to do, but have them stop and then reverse so that eventually CO2 emissions from the power industry would be much smaller, consistent with a worldwide effort to reduce CO2 emissions on the order of half by the year 2050, which is a long way down the road, not fully, but a long way down the road of what we need to do to stabilize the atmosphere. This is what they think would be needed. And then they filled in this difference, this huge difference, the wedge, with different slices of technologies and initiatives that could help make this reduction. So energy efficiency is shown in blue, renewable energy, they're a little more pessimistic about renewable energy than you are. Renewable energy is shown in green and so on. And I want to draw your attention to this orange slice right here, which is their expectation of the role of these CCS plants, carbon capture and storage plants, totally new kind of coal-based technology for generating electricity. And to put some numbers on it, what they expect is that by the year 2030, in order for the industry as a whole to make its contribution to controlling CO2 emissions, you have to have 350 million tons of CO2 per year injected underground. That's a big number. That is, at typical pressures for underground injection, about 4.5 million barrels a day of stuff, per day of stuff. 4.5 million barrels a day is a lot. It's not outside the realm of what we're used to designing in engineering systems. The world oil market today, for example, is 86 million barrels a day. So it's a huge amount of material. It's about 1/5 of total US oil consumption. You need piping and wells and all that stuff in order to move 4.5 million barrels a day. This is just the United States. So remember this number, 350 million tons of CO2 per year. This next slide is a result of my colleague Varun Rai's work at Stanford, where what we've done is we've gone and we've looked at every single announcement anywhere in the world for one of these CCS plants. And we've put it on this chart according to the volume of CO2 that it would store underground. So we have a chart here that stacks up the volumes. And then Varun, and he has to x-ray his incoming mail now from power companies because he's ranked all of these according to the probability that these projects are actually going to exist. Because it turns out, shock as it may be, there's a lot of vaporware in the energy business. So people announce things and then they don't really happen. And so we've ranked all these things and then we put this chart up and we stand back. And so the ranking is possible projects and then speculative, much less than 50% probability that they would exist. And what you see on this chart is that if you add up the total level of effort, even if all the speculative projects came into being,
By the year 2025, almost the year 2030, we think total world effort in this area, these advanced CCS plants, is only 100 million tons of CO2 per year. And if you then adjust that for the probability these projects really exist, the total world effort is roughly 1% of what the world power industry needs to do in order for CCS to play its role in storing CO2. So my point is that this major technological option, and also one of the major competitors potentially to renewable energy, is in fact not doing well at all. One more point on this, and then I'm going to move on. It turns out that you can do a lot with a CO2 when you inject it underground. If you're going to be injecting millions of barrels per day of CO2, mostly you're going to be injecting it underground and you're just hoping it's going to stay there. And I think the geology around that has worked out fairly well. But you can inject some CO2 underground and use that for making more oil and natural gas. And so what Varun has done in this next slide is he's color-coded all these projects according to which ones are involved in actually making more fossil fuels and which ones are involved in storing the CO2 underground and keeping it there, which are the kinds of projects that we ultimately need at scale. The ones that are involved in making more fossil fuels are colored in black. So if you didn't catch the message, there's the original slide, and then here's the new slide. So if you remove these projects because they are filling an unusual niche market that very soon will be filled up, what you see is the total world effort in this one technology alone is roughly 0.1% of what you need in order to stabilize emissions from the power industry over the next 50 years. The coal-based part of the power industry is falling severely far behind in the carbon challenge. Last couple slides, I just want to flag something that will be potentially important, although right now we don't think it's that big a deal, which is so-called coal to liquids. So this is take coal and through various chemical processes turn it into a liquid fuel. People get excited about this because they think it's going to help boost energy security. If you think the world coal market is becoming a global market just like the oil market, then this energy security argument is kind of hard to maintain. Right now it's awfully expensive, although high oil prices have helped make it much more cost effective. It's unbelievably carbon intensive. Roughly twice as much carbon per gallon of gasoline or diesel fuel comes from this mechanism when compared with conventional petroleum products. There are some projects underway to try and make these liquid fuels out of coal and also store the carbon underground. It's unclear how well those are going to work. So to close, where does coal look in broader perspective? And to answer that question, I want to stop with two slides. The first one is the slide I showed earlier, which indicated that actually there's a lot of coal plants being built in this country. Despite the best efforts of the environmental community to mobilize and stop coal plants, and a growing interest by the courts in considering the possible implications for CO2, you're starting to see more coal plants. And this chart here just shows you that coal build relative to all the other technologies that people think are likely to be built out in the coming years. Coal is shown in black, natural gas is shown in blue, renewables, which is your principal focus, are shown in green. And if you look at the year 2007, 2008, roughly the current period, what you see is that renewables are a very large part of the build out of the electric power system, but they are still roughly on average a minority compared to natural gas. And I think the big news in 2009 will be that coal actually could be a dominant part of the US build out, despite looming regulations on carbon dioxide. This is the last slide I want to show because your RE is Less Than T's team asked me to talk a little bit about costs. How much does it cost to build a conventional coal-fired power plant, and how does that compare with other sources of electricity? The way in this industry we normally compare costs is we levelize them. We imagine what would it cost to go to the bank and take out a loan to build the power plant? What would it cost to buy the fuel? What would it cost to maintain the plant? And you put all that in, including the loan service, and you levelize that so that over the lifetime of the plant, you have the average level cost of electricity. It's a little bit, think of it a little bit like a mortgage. And so the question is, what's the levelized cost of electricity for different kinds of technologies? In this slide, I'm just going to show coal because your team is much more advanced than I could ever be in understanding renewable energy. And this slide shows you conventional coal plants in the maroon down here The standard I'd like you to focus on right now are what are called supercritical pulverized coal plants, which is a standard industry plant that's built in this country and most of the world at the margin today. And then the cost of building a coal plant that would have CCS, so capturing the CO2 and then injecting it underground. These results were done about a year and a half ago. And what it showed is that the levelized cost was about $50 to $60 a megawatt hour for conventional coal plants. That's roughly 5 cents to 6 cents per kilowatt hour. When you open your bill from PG&E, nobody has 5 cents to 6 cents a kilowatt hour because PG&E has lots of other fees that they attach to it. Most importantly, the cost of getting the wholesale power over the wires and delivered to you in your house. And the conventional wisdom was that these new plants would cost roughly double to store the CO2 underground. How does this compare with renewable energy options? Well, with this data here, C was still probably less expensive than the major renewable energy options. Let's set aside rooftop solar photovoltaics, which people like to have around because they look good, but they're not economic with current technology, and in my view, will never be economic, but who knows about the distant future. The really big contenders, in my view, are centralized solar thermal power stations and bulk wind. And in most of the world settings, coal would still be cheaper than bulk wind, which was, depending on where you're looking and so on, was $60 to maybe $80 a megawatt hour. But, and here's where I'll end. These data were done a year and a half ago. This is a project by Electric Power Research Institute, the same organization I mentioned earlier. They're in the process of updating this right now because it turns out that the cost of everything, all commodities in the world market, has risen dramatically, and in particular the cost of steel, stainless steel, chrome, concrete, and engineers. Maybe because engineers are excited about going into software and not so excited about building nuclear plants and coal plants and so on. And when you put the cost of all that together, the capital cost of building a coal-fired power plant in the last 2 years alone has gone up by maybe 40%, maybe 50%. To put a number on it, for those of you who follow this closely, it looks like $3,200 per kilowatt of capacity. And if you combine that with the higher cost of coal, the levelized cost of coal today for building a new plant is maybe $100 a megawatt hour, 10 cents per kilowatt hour, which suggests to me, and this is where I'll stop, that in fact, you've caught the bus. Let me stop here and open it up for questions.
How much of the cost of the coal is in buying the gasoline? Sorry, how much of the cost of the coal is in buying the gasoline to get it out of the ground?
Oh, a tiny fraction. A tiny fraction. I mean, the coal industry, I've told a complex picture here, which doesn't have a simple answer, because that is the nature of the dynamics in this industry right now. On the one hand, prices are high, and in particular, price of coal-fired electricity are very high for forces that I've discussed. On the other hand, the coal industry has been the source of an unbelievable technological innovation in the last 20 years. And I urge anyone who wants to do this to go visit a mine like the one in the picture for the flyer of this here. This is not an underground mine with people with shovels and a hat. This is a massive strip mine. That mine that we show there is the one just outside Gillette that is now, today, I think, producing 80 million tons of coal per year. And I think we counted the number of people actually in operating stations in the mine, and I believe there were 14. And it's all electrified. Almost all of it is electrified because the most energy-intensive parts of the mining operation are better run, like the drag line, better run with electricity. The fuel cost of doing all of that at scale, and the Australians are even further ahead, is a tiny fraction.
I have a question about carbon capture and sequestration. I just want to make sure I understood the graph. It looked like you said that CCS could account, or is accounting for 1% of what would be needed if we got to the level that we think we would get to given the projects that are coming online. If you multiply that number by 100, was that 10 gigatons of CO2 that we need to be injecting by CCS? 'Cause that's a huge amount.
Yeah, it would be on the order of 1 gigaton from CCS alone. Now, these calculations move around depending on one's assumptions about the cost of the technology and so on. And I think part of the shock coming out of the power industry over the next year or two will be folks revising these numbers downward, because real companies trying to build real projects are finding out that the financial risk associated with these projects is enormous, and therefore they're much less optimistic today than they were before. But yeah, there's a huge amount of material that would be needed. To put this in perspective, if we took just the roughly 4.5 to 5 million barrels a day of stuff, of CO2 that would be needed in this country alone, and put it into pipelines, the size of the pipeline network, roughly, would be as large or a bit larger than the entire natural gas pipeline network in the country. And people are talking about doing this in 20 years, whereas it took 100 years to build a gas pipeline network. So the scale is unbelievable.
But we're talking about 1 gigaton capture that's
Yes.
needed by 2050.
Roughly.
Approximately, okay.
Question? Yeah.
Hey, David, could you talk about, going back to your slide with new capacity additions in the U.S., why there's expected to be such a spike in new coal capacity, and also why there's a decrease in new renewables capacity projected beyond 2008?
So let me say a couple words about this, and it rapidly becomes a much more complex discussion. I think there are two things going on here. One is that people who tried to build coal plants and faced enormous difficulties. When the price of oil and the natural gas went up, starting 5 or 6 years ago, it took a while to get rid of all the gas that was on order. This big spike in gas, 2002, 2003, if you like, is the hangover from Enron. So it's in the late 1990s, all these companies wanting to be Enron, gas-fired companies, so they all placed orders for gas turbines. Then many of them went bankrupt, but then the turbines still arrived. And so you have all these turbines being commissioned, many of which are still not being used to full load. And something similar has happened in coal. When the price of gas went up sharply, people said, well, let's just build coal plants. So they went out and they started trying to build coal plants. They ran into lots of opposition. And while that resulted in a cancellation of many plants, on average about 14% of the announced plants survive all the way through the exciting Olympics. But it didn't result in everything getting canceled. And so instead what's happened is they've been delayed and stretched out. The wind point here is because the group making this projection is the Energy Information Administration, which is part of the Department of Energy. And although they're independent, in my view, they are politically wise to only make assumptions about existing policies or likely policies. And as you know, one of the hardest things when you're in the wind and solar business today is to figure out what Congress is going to do. Maybe that's true in any business, because the expiration of the production and investment tax credits. And so that's, I think, explains why wind is probably underrepresented, and there'll probably be a little more stretch out of coal. But the basic point, which is we should not be surprised to see a lot of new coal plants come on, which partially is good news because they're replacing old, even dirtier plants. That news is happening, but on a local level that when you add up at the national level is quite consequential.
Two questions. So first, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. And I particularly am going to take away the 10 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity from coal. U.S. CAP and Fred Krupp have estimated that a cap and trade system would add 2 cents per kilowatt hour for the cost of electricity from coal on a base of 4 cents per kilowatt hour in the U.S. and 3 cents per kilowatt hour in China. That would be a global price. So whether it is now 2 cents on top of your 10 cents or not, which would be 20%, or 2 cents on top of 5, 6, 7 cents in China, that's a huge amount. Do you agree with that? Does that sound right to you?
I think we have no clue. And I think we have no clue because that calculation is right in an engineering sense. If you went off, you had signals for companies to change their behavior. They went out and they optimally acquired new technology. They installed it, and so on. But two things are happening in the carbon markets today. One of them is that the actual signal from the marketplace to real companies is much more muted and fragmented around the world. So there's no global carbon market, for example. There's an emerging US market that's probably going to have 4 or 5 different markets in it, because California will do something different from the Northeast, and on and on and on. And you have a European market. How you hand out the emission credits in the beginning really matters, because if you're a coal-fired power company and you're given the emission credits for free based on your actual emissions, then you actually have, ironically, an incentive to increase your emissions, at least for a period of time, rather than decrease them. And the value of those emission credits gets treated by regulators in different ways. And so when you work all that out, what I'm worried about, frankly, is not that the engineers can't fix this problem. I think actually the solutions are in sight, and things like your initiative help make them in sight. I'm worried that the real regulatory and investment climate doesn't see clear signals and therefore can't figure out what to deploy. So that's one caveat there. The other thing I'd like to say is the estimate that it would only cost 2 cents per kilowatt hour wholesale increase in electricity price in this country to reduce carbon emissions. It's sensitive to a lot of different factors. Set that aside for a moment. It's unbelievably sensitive to one's assumption about the capital cost of the technology. So if you think the industry is going to go off and build a lot of CCS plants and advanced nuclear plants and so on as part of its solution, then the fact that the capital cost of building a nuclear plant has gone in the last 5 years from, this is hypothetical because nobody's built one, from $2,000 a kilowatt to $5,000 to, I can defend $8,000 a kilowatt for CapEx. Maybe not for a long period of time, but that's a huge increase. And similarly, the increase, most of the price of the coal-fired electricity is the capital cost. And so if the coal plants have now doubled to tripled in cost, then the cost of building a plant that has more gizmos attached to it and more pipes presumably is going to rise as well. All of that is if you think renewable energy is less capital intensive, which is true in some settings, many settings, all of that suggests that that would be good news for RE is less than C.
And in that context, your colleague, Sally Benson at Stanford, why is she so bullish about carbon capture sequestration based on the data that you've just shown?
Because I think there's and again, who knows what's really going to happen over the long term. When real companies build real projects and they get experience and they discover that the projects work, which is highly likely because people like Sally are working on this technology and her own work is making sure the CO2 stays underground. Thank you very much. When real companies have this experience, then presumably the cost is going to come down, just as the cost of renewable energy has come down with experience. But there's a yawning gap between the assessment of the technological and engineering potential here and the real financing of real projects. And the more capital intensive and risky the projects, the harder it is to close that gap.
Thank you.
Yes. And I'm going to draw on some of my colleagues to answer some of these questions as we touch on the details. Please.
How does the price to move electricity around affect the price of coal and other fuels? And how far can we transport electricity?
The question is, how much does it cost to move electricity around, and how far can we transmit it? The cost of moving electricity around is a very small fraction of the total final cost of electricity. Moving electricity around until you get to the neighborhood. When you get to the neighborhood, the cost of your final electric bill, depending on the neighborhood and depending on how good your power company is almost half of the total final electric bill, because all those wires are carrying small amounts of electricity, but it's very capital intensive. But long-distance transmission is relatively inexpensive, although the cost of that is going up as well. It used to cost $1 million a mile to build a standard high-voltage transmission line. The latest estimates I heard earlier this week are $2 million a mile. I haven't heard 3 yet. It might be $3 million a mile in places where it's expensive to acquire the land. So those costs have gone up as well. Typically, 4 or 5% of the electricity maximum is lost during the transmission process. And those losses are due to the resistance in the power lines themselves, and so there are some theoretical limits here. Normally, power is not moved distances greater than several hundred miles to perhaps 800, maybe 1,000 miles. That's roughly the outer limit. There's an enormous amount of innovation, though, in the power line business. There are much higher voltage lines being tested, million-volt lines, and there's high-voltage DC lines. So these are lines that have extremely low line loss, and they allow you to direct the current, and so the whole line doesn't have to resonate at the same frequency as the rest of the grid. If those innovations really take off, that could change renewable energy radically, and it could also change CCS radically. For renewable energy, it means we could put wind, for example, in the places that are the windiest and move bulk power long distances. For CCS, it means we could put the power plants on top of the places where you'd store the carbon and move the power as electrons rather than the current vision, which is to build the power plants closer to the load and then move the CO2 by pipelines to places where you can inject it.
Are we expecting global markets for transported across continents?
Well, not yet global markets. There's been some really interesting work done, still mostly theoretical, on superconductivity. There's, I believe, one superconducting line in Detroit, and maybe one other that's operating in this country, a couple others around the world. If that were really were to work, you could imagine continental-style supergrids. That's still a ways off. There is an international market for electricity, in particular in Europe, mainly because the countries are smaller, so everything's more international, but also because the Russians have a very strong incentive to build bulk power and send it to Western Europe.
In your bus chasing the dog chasing the bus analogy.
Yeah, the bus is not chasing the dog yet.
No, but if things become equal, the bus is still has actually, may not have slowed down all that much. We're still digging up all the coal out of the ground that's reasonable at that price. You alluded to China and India as being a large part of the building demand for that. I wonder if you had any nuggets to add about how you could mitigate the effects of all that added demand, because that seems to be why you're digging up that much coal.
Yeah, I'm going to ask my colleague Jeremy Carl, who works in both China and India, to talk about the answer to that question. There's a microphone right there. Why don't you just come up here so that the video can capture you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, and I think one of the key sort of opportunities is to look where the real leverage is. And I think one of the difficulties, even when you kind of get excited, and as I understand, kind of RE Less Than C is focused on new generation and not necessarily looking quite as much at what the inflection point is to begin to maybe turn off some of the existing coal that you've got going. But I think one of the challenges in a place like China is they've just built out an enormous amount of infrastructure. And so those costs have the big costs have sort of been paid, and it makes it a little more difficult to dislodge. In India, as was alluded to in the slide, there's a little bit more opportunity. I'm doing a lot of research right now on the state-owned Indian coal company. Because it's so dysfunctional, there are more opportunities for somebody to come in there and innovate and potentially come in with some interesting renewable ideas. Now, the renewables industry in India is also kind of dysfunctional, but in different ways. So there are some more, I think, opportunities to do some interesting things in countries like India and China. And I'm a little bit worried that the discussion, quite naturally, because we're in the U.S., becomes very U.S. focused. But in the slides that David showed, I think you really see that if we're serious about incremental growth, you really do have to look quite seriously at China and India. Does that answer your question for the most part?
We've got time for a couple more questions. I just want to see if anyone on the VC had a question. Quick? Okay. No.
How much of taxes or carbon trading would be necessary to provide a significant incentive to reduce the carbon?
So let me answer that in a way that'll probably result in my door pass at Stanford getting revoked, because what I'm going to say is very anti-market. I think we have vastly oversold the role of the market in this area and the role of price signals, because we're actually trying to solve two problems simultaneously. One problem is, if people have a bunch of technologies on the shelf, as it were, we want the marketplace to send a signal so that they choose less carbon-intensive technologies in a way that's cost-effective and so on. And that's a terrific and very powerful role of markets, and that's what these carbon markets are doing right now. My own view is that the carbon markets are a serious mistake because they turn this into a casino, because the price of the carbon goes up and down. You get all these people day trading and so on instead of focusing on their day job, as it were. And a much better policy would be a tax. It would make it much clearer what the carbon would cost, would make it much easier to plan these long-lived industrial investments. That's all about how you take technologies that are already there and encourage decent behavior around those technologies. The other problem, which is in my view actually the bigger problem here right now, is how do you get the technologies to a state of maturity where they can actually be deployed? And there, carbon markets are a small part of the story. They send a price signal that encourages the right kind of behavior, but the bigger part of the story is direct funding of research and development, in some cases smartly designed mandates. You know, one of the reasons that wind is so inexpensive today is because of enormous technological innovation on the back of mandates and feed-in tariffs and subsidies and things like that. And I think the big policy challenge here is to design those in a smart way that directly encourage innovation. My own view, which is probably different from your own team's view, my own view is that these bulk coal solutions and bulk nuclear solutions have to be an enormous part of the story because that's where a lot of the energy is, and frankly, that's where a lot of the politics are. And if we're not serious about that, we're going to end up with solutions that don't exist in the real world. But it requires targeting the technologies directly. And I think that point, people imagine you set up a carbon market and then it all kind of falls into place and we hold hands and sing Kumbaya, and that's just nuts. Last question. Why don't both of you ask the questions, and then I'll answer them as a tandem.
So, my understanding is that coal plants are basically exempt from environmental regulations because they're grandfathered in before they were written, and so therefore they can produce huge amounts of solid waste as well as gaseous waste, whereas other plants are subject to the regulations, so nuclear ones can't compete with them. Is that still true, or has that changed?
Briefly, that's not true. That was true for some regulations, some of the most onerous regulations in the United States under the Clean Air Act when it was amended in 1977, because the thinking was that these older plants were on their way out, and politically it was a really hard thing to do. You make compromises in politics. And then there's a bunch of technical kind of legal interpretation of when is a plant been upgraded so much that you've done the equivalent of building a new plant. But this image that there is, you know, it's the Wild West at these coal plants and folks are just chucking stuff in and setting it on fire and out comes electricity is not correct. In fact, this industry is in the middle of a wrenching, enormous capital investment to apply much more aggressive environmental controls on the whole fleet, more or less, of coal-fired power plants, and to repower, take out old plants and put in new plants. And when most of the CEOs in this industry sit down and they think about their strategy, frankly, they spend much more time thinking about that than most of these other problems, because in today's market in the US, that's where the billions and billions of dollars of capital expenditure are right now. And the carbon stuff, because of dithering in Congress and so on, the carbon stuff is more speculative and therefore harder to build into one's investment plans. Okay, thank you. Oh, yeah.
If I can go back to your analogy of the dog and the bus.
I'm sorry about the analogy of the dog and the bus.
I like it, actually. So you're saying that maybe the dog has actually caught the bus, but nobody can ride a bus, or can ride a dog. Do you see any of the renewables, even if they are on par, being able to scale to the point they could actually compete in a real market?
Yeah, I think what's happening in bulk renewables today is some of it's uneconomic. Some of a lot of things in life are uneconomic. But the tenor of it is unbelievably interesting right now. So you take these large central station solar plants, let alone wind. there are, in addition to innovation in the generation of electricity, there's an unbelievable amount of innovation in storage. Some of it integral to the solar technology itself, and some of it new battery concepts, compressed air underground. There's a huge compressed air project being developed in Texas to connect to wind, which would allow, when wind is dispatched, to be dispatched more reliably. And these ancillary innovations, along with the core innovations in renewable energy, are extremely exciting. This is a very exciting time to be even in the utility business, which was previously thought to be one of the dullest industries on the planet. It's incredible because they are in the middle of a revolution, and it's not clear who's going to win. For renewables, there's still a lot of work to be done, in my view, on the ancillary innovations and on integrating renewables with the grid to make reliable delivery so that you don't have to kind of do the equivalent of control-delete periodically. And you see that innovation happening, though. It's very, very exciting. Thank you very much.
So let me just thank David Victor for a great talk. I also want to thank his colleagues Varun, Jeremy, and Richard, and I also want to thank Michael Terrell, my colleague, who organized this today. And I think we're going to try to do some more sessions like this because I think it's very helpful in encouraging this sort of discussion at Google. So thank you, David, and to your colleagues. We really appreciate it.